it was occurring to me about how to prepare an estimate and realizing as this was being introduced, this is the last one of this year, last one heading into the holidays. And this might sound like a fairly sort of heavy topic, estimating all that sort of stuff, but really, this is what we do day in, day out. I'm sure most of us have been spending a lot of time in the last month estimating how much food to buy, how many presents to buy, where we need to be, how long it's going to take us to get there. And so really, this coupled with the scheduling one that you're going to get from Craig a little later is what we do. It's codified common sense. It's just taking what we do and putting it into a structure. So we can go to the next slide here. These are the goals that I want to be able to cover. And so you can hold me accountable to these. If we get to the end and we feel we haven't done it, then feel free to ask the questions. But really, we're going to cover basics. This is going to be quite a sprint. There's a lot to get through. So buckle up and listen carefully with the pop quizzes. I gather this is the first time we've tried pop quizzes, so we're learning as much as anyone else is on this. But really, we're not going to show you how to do takeoff. I'm not going to sit here and say, well, you pick up the scale rule or you click on this on the screen, but focusing on the best practices, how we structure it, how we develop prices, but most of all, how we speak truth and communicate estimates clearly. An estimate is not done until the client or the user or whoever has received it and fully understood it. And so these are the outcomes I'm looking for, so that you can define your purpose, you can develop good data. Documenting uncertainty and risk is a very important piece, using good communication and figuring out how to put in the contingencies and escalation and market allowances. So we can go to the next slide. Actually, the next one after this, so it's answering the first question, what is it we're doing? What is an estimate? And really, it's what is an estimate for? So we can go to the next slide. And really, it's all about meeting the needs. We often think that we do an estimate because that's what we've been told to do. But it's all there because the college has this vision statement. We want to meet the needs of our multicultural community. How do we meet those needs? Okay, we meet it, as it says on that statement there, by providing accessible, high-quality educational programs and services. Notice right there, it doesn't actually talk about putting a building in. It's meeting the needs by providing services. So how do we do that? Well, we create beautiful state-of-the-art facilities. So how do we do that? We do it through value-oriented design and construction. We want to make every dollar sweat. We want to make every dollar work as hard as it possibly can. So we do that by having a value-focused delivery team, and we do that by having effective cost estimates. So when we're doing our cost estimates and we're down there in the trenches working late at night trying to get the estimate to work, it's important for us to remember that the reason we're doing it is because we're going to meet the needs of this community through the gift of the voter bond. So the community has put trust in us. Our estimates are there to fulfill that trust. We can go to the next slide. So the estimate is a tool. It's not an end in itself. A lot of times I see people just saying, okay, there's an estimate because I need to know what it's going to cost. No, it's this tool that will help deliver that success and a tool that will help us maximize value. It's also fundamentally something that lets somebody else do what they need to do. It's allowing a decision maker to make an informed decision within the context of their own values and opinions. And it's a tool for communicating complex and specialist inputs in a very clear and concise manner. So it's not just a set of numbers, it's a communication device to allow somebody else to make a great decision. So we can go to the next slide. And so, as I say, fundamentally, they're communication tools. And everything we do in our estimate, we need to be clear, comprehensive, and logical so that we can explain all of the numbers in our work, again, so that somebody else can participate as part of this team to create great things for the community. So we can go to the next slide. So what we do is we take a whole lot of very complicated inputs. It could be the drawings, it could be the specifications, but it's also the stuff that's not being given to us by the design team, the standards. We should know the standards. We have to understand the codes and regulations and the statutes. So we take all of this material, we process it, that's us in the middle there, and we deliver our report, which is essentially advice. Go to the next slide. And as I say, it's about decisions, and those decisions are oftentimes we've been asked, I need an estimate, but really what people are asking is, can I afford to do it? Can I make money off this? Is the value greater than the cost? So we can go to the next one. And so these are really talking about best practices as to how do we deliver that information. So the next slide. So about delivering excellence, yes, there are 3 pieces to it, actually 4 pieces. Doing the right job, making sure that what we're doing is actually what's being asked for. Many times someone says, I want an estimate, and the first thing we do is we sit down, we start measuring stuff, counting stuff, because that's the stuff that takes the least effort. And we don't actually stop to ask, well, what is it that you want to do with this estimate? Do you just need to know, can I afford to go forward? Maybe at that point we can use conceptual numbers. If they need to know how many door handles there are, we're going to have to count those. So making sure we're doing the right job. Once we know that, then we can do the job right. We can develop the work plan, we can have the quality plan, and we're going to cover all of those things. Then the third step is making sure we did the job right. Are we doing the quality control that we are obliged to do? And are we getting the right sign off? And then the fourth part about this really is, are we communicating it well? So we can go to the next slide. Where there are best practices, these are a series of ASTM standards. They're a little bit of dry reading, but they're not a bad thing to try if you can lay your hands on. If you can only get your hands on one of them, go for that E1804, because those describe the standard procedures for doing estimates. And it's a very good thing to read through. E1557 is the uniformat standard, again, a very good one. The others are well worth reading, though, because they help us maintain a standard protocol so that as we're doing our estimates, other people can pick it up and read it and move on from that. So we can go to the next slide. There's another really good location for getting best practice, and that's the Government Accountability Office, GAO. They keep changing what the GAO stands for, so I can never remember quite which one it is. But really, as you see those 4 big sections, there's the initiation section, the assessment section, the analysis section, presentation. And if you get a chance, go grab this. It's a report written by the GAO, very, very well written, very detailed. And so these are the steps we're going to go through today is how do we do the initiation? How do we actually structure the assessment, the estimate? How do we do the analysis to make sure it makes sense? And then how do we do the presentation? But I would really encourage you, go grab this from GAO. This one is free. The ASTMs you sometimes have to pay for. So someone's giving you really good, free, well-written documentation there. So we can go to the next slide. So these are also things that come out of the GAO study that say when we're delivering this excellence, these are the things they say an estimate should have. It should be comprehensive. If we are making exclusions in our estimates, we have to make sure somebody else has picked it up. Our exclusion is somebody else's inclusion. So it's not enough for us to say, oh, I didn't have the FF&E. Does somebody have the FF&E, the furniture, fixtures, and equipment? Does somebody have the IT equipment? So we need to make sure that we are accountable for comprehensive. You can go to the next one now. We have to be well documented. We have to be auditable. Oftentimes estimates, particularly if people are working in Excel, a lot of stuff is typed into cells. So you can see formulas and everything like that. That's not good documentation because it's easy to make mistakes. It's very difficult for someone to track your threads. And also when it's then printed, all of that information is lost. So everything we do should be completely documentable. We can go to the next slide. Accurate, that maybe goes without saying, but it is important. And it's important to remember that accuracy really means telling the truth. It's not precision. Accuracy, as the word cure is in the middle of that word, and it really is the same word, cure. It's towards bringing care to our clients. And so if the uncertainty is there, accuracy means saying, you know, this is uncertain. We can go to the next slide. And credibility. we've got to be able to back everything up we say. We've got to be able to show where it comes from, how we address the risk and uncertainty. So we can go to the next slide. So the first bit about it is setting the course. And this is a step that many of our folks in estimating leave out. We go to the next slide. So defining the purpose, who needs the estimate and what are they going to do with it? As I mentioned before, if someone is just trying to say, I just need to know whether I can afford this project, we may not need to do a fully detailed estimate. It may be enough just to be able to look at it and say, we're looking at some parameters. We believe it's enough to make the next step to move forward. And an important question is the confidence range and what is the nature of the target we're aiming for? Quite often someone says, I want an estimate plus or minus, but what they really mean is I want an estimate that I will not go over. And so by confidence range, we're saying, I can't guarantee this number to you, but I can give you a level of confidence that says at an 80th percentile of probability, at a very high level of probability, you will be within this number. That's different from I'm estimating for the middle of the pack. So if we're saying, where do I think this is going to bid, or where do I think is a number that's a safe number for you to work with? And only the client can define their confidence range and the nature of the target they're aiming for. And so if we don't understand that, we can often give them the wrong answer or an answer that is not helpful to them. So is this one that is, do you think I can get this building in for $10 million? Yes or no? Well, with a high level of confidence, I believe we can come in under $10 million. That's one thing. Then the next question is, well, what do you really think it's going to bid for? That might be $9 million. And so we need to define this and ideally get it written down. So the next slide. And then it kind of hard, we're estimators, we're boring people. We came into estimating because accountancy was too scary. No, as estimators, we really have to understand the passion. We have to understand the community and to a large degree be willing and really enjoy listening to the stories, listening to why people want these buildings. A lot of this is stuff that will be, particularly as estimators, when we're coming in early in the project and the design is not completed, we want to understand what's lighting the fire for the community. So that we can make sure that we've met that in the estimate. And then what is the value we're delivering? What is it that allows someone else to do something? An estimate on its own has no value until it allows someone to do something. So next slide. Okay, now the boring bit, the tough bit. We have to develop a plan. And again, so often people don't sit down and write the plan, and it doesn't have to be written, but we do have to have some sense of, what is the information available? Again, oftentimes I see people leap into the drawings and start estimating, get to a day before the estimate is due and start saying, well, where am I going to get the numbers from? So find out what information is available. What more am I going to need? Who owns this information? And if there is no information, who is the person who can make the best guess? Someone might say, well, we don't know how big the foundations are. Okay, how can I come up with a number that can work on that? Is it me as an estimator who can give you the best guess? Or do we talk to the engineer and say, well, I know you haven't designed this yet, but can you give me an idea of how big this needs to be? Do I need any other specialists in my team? Do I need someone who really understands IT, educational IT? Who knows what is the cost of all the projectors and the microphones and the cameras? Is that part of my estimate? If so, do I have someone who can bring that? What information do I need to bring to the table? And all the inclusions and exclusions. And so really, this is the sort of thing that we don't just wait until we run over that problem in the estimating process. Let's get the plan written down. Next slide. And then what level of detail is appropriate? Should this be one that's done at very detailed labor and material? Should it be done at a high level concept? So what is the right level? What format? Rather than plowing in and saying, well, this is the format we always use, what is it that is needed to support the process? And sometimes the question is, can I even do this? That we may be at a point where we just have to say to the team, you know, we just do not have enough information to provide you the level of detail you need at this point. So we're recommending a little bit more research before we start the estimate. So we can go to the next slide. So once we've set the course, set the plan, set up the structure. So the format should follow purpose. For those of you who are familiar with it, uniformat is a functional basing. So it structures the estimate around what's the cost for foundations, for structure, for skin, for roofing, for interiors, all of those things. It's a very useful methodology because I don't have to know what the skin is made of. I just need to know I have to buy a skin. It also allows me to do comparisons with prior estimates. I can say, on these last 10 classroom buildings, the interior partitions have cost me $25 a square foot. And so there's a reasonable chance that this next classroom is going to cost somewhere around $25 a square foot. Again, I don't need to know what it's made of. I just need to know what the function is. It also allows us to tie it back to the program and passion, because the passion is around function, not materials. Master format is one that I think a lot of contractors will be very familiar with, which is it's by the method. It's got divisions for concrete, for steel, for wood, for plaster and gypsum board. And so that's useful when you get towards the bidding stage where you want to know how are the bids going to come in. So deciding on the format, again, talk to the client, find out what they'd like to know. And the detail should be fit for purpose. And so if it needs to be highly detailed, let's make it highly detailed. But generally the detail is to help us get to a summary. So we can go to the client and say, yeah, you're right. This is a $9 million project. And then the last bit is establish the basis and the assumptions. Quite often this is the last thing that is written. Ideally, it should be the first thing that's written. What is it we've got in, and what is it that we have excluded that we believe someone else is covering? Assumptions is a word I typically dislike because it seems to me often to say, well, I didn't know and I couldn't be bothered to ask. But we need to make sure that we're documenting where we are making assumptions and what's not defined by the design, and then writing up the uncertainty. We can go to the next slide. So these are just showing the uniformat on the left there and the master format in the center. These are the categories of the breakdown there. Go to the next slide. And fundamentally, it's our responsibility to ask the questions and understand the vision. There are no excuses in estimating. We have to be ready to say, we made sure we set out on the right path before we set out, so we can give the right answers to the client. So I believe the next slide is, oh no, there's one more slide, the summary slide. Don't need to go through this particularly. Understanding the purpose, the passion, create the plan, establish the structure, establish the basis, and then confirm it. So we're going to try our first pop quiz here. So are we ready there? This is one where it's just a simple question. It's not a graded answer. We're not even sure if we'll see your answers. So I'm hoping this is coming up at a moment. We're not seeing it yet, or I'm not. There we go. So I believe you click on the answers. What is an estimate? Why might you do the estimate? To help someone make a decision, set a budget, be ready for value engineering, or all of the above. So we'll give you a moment or two to click on that and we'll see how the score's going. And I believe that we're able to watch as people put their marks in. How are we doing?
I think they're nervous. They're thinking.
They're thinking. Oh, this doesn't take any thinking. We need to answer this one. So. How are we doing?
Is there a little graph that pops up about the results or what?
We're hoping so. Let's see what happens when we click that button.
There are 2 more people who need to vote.
Okay, well, we're almost out of time. Are we able to see the answers? There we go. Yes. it wasn't meant to be a trick question, but this is a good one. So it really is all of the above. We really do want to be able to help someone make a decision. I appreciate all of those who voted for it because it was clearly what I was saying it was done. But we also are doing it so that we can set budgets and be ready for value engineering. No right answer there, just to getting a start. So let's close that one and move on to the next.
But
So-
my professor, we must acknowledge that was our very first poll and Build a Peralta Academy. And 72% of them got the answer right. So congratulations and thank
they're all
you
right.
for that moment.
Yes, all of them were right. So we'll see how we do going on. So creating the estimate. So yes, we're moving into this. And I did see that there's a question that come in through the Q&A. Are we going to get into the detail? Yes, this is where we're starting to get into some of this, the heavy lifting. A little bit more moving into how we do the economics of the pricing. So let's move to the next slide. So the important thing to remember is that a price is a bargain between a willing buyer and seller. It's based on offer and acceptance. If I put in a price and someone else doesn't pick it, then it's really not the price. It really has very little to do with input costs. And so we often get caught up around, well, how much did it cost to build it, to make this product? But really, it's all about what I can get for it in the open marketplace. And so this is a little bit of classic economics, is that the blue curve is the demand curve. If the price is very high, I don't want much of it. As the price comes down, I am willing to buy more of it. And so what you see there is you've got a curve that has very low, low demand at the high price, high demand at the low price. There are some products that don't quite follow that curve, but generally speaking, this is a sort of fairly easy way of looking at it. The supplier is looking at it the other way around, as if the price is very low, I'm not willing to make much of this stuff. But when the price is high, I'm willing to make a lot of it. So their curve goes the opposite direction. And generally speaking, if you want to click the button one more time here, the price is set at the point at which my demand matches somebody else's willingness to supply. So when a movie comes out and it comes out first and it's available online on streaming because none of us can go to the cinema anymore, and it says it's $20, and I say, hey, no, I'll wait and I'll give it another month or two until the price drops. And so over time, you get to this equilibrium price. And it's really driven by real cost and by perception. If I can convince you that my watch is worth $1,000 and I can get that perception in your mind, even if it's only a $10 watch, I've distorted the cost. And so the important thing about pricing is that it really is the bargain. There's not an objective price. So we can click one more time. And what happens there is, if the supply moves, if a supplier suddenly says, well, I want more money, then the price doesn't go up all the way to where the supplier wants to go, because the demand curve, it moves down, and people demand less as the price goes up. So we can click the next one. And so it really is, if there's one thing you take out of here, there's no such thing as an objective price. Price really is something that moves around as we move on through our estimating process. So next slide. So some other bits about pricing is that a classic example of pricing is a pizza. And so you've got the variable cost, the flour. The more pizzas I make, the more flour I need, the more water I need, the more yeast I need. It's a very plain pizza. It's just cheese and sauce. I hope you're okay with that. But there's fixed cost. I've got to buy the pizza oven. I've got to have staff benefits. I've got utilities. And then there's profit. I want to be rewarded for the risk I'm taking. And this is one of the reasons why oftentimes you see buy one, get one free, or buy one, get the next one for half off. So we can click to the next slide. A little bit of a lag there. So as you look at the price of things, there's a certain amount of fixed cost. My first pizza has to buy the price of the pizza oven. And so if I sell one pizza, it's going to cost $200. If I sell three, they're at $240. And so again, as we're building our prices and understanding this process, we need to know how construction costs work. Is it something that is a very specialized thing in the project, or is this something that really is largely variable cost? We can go to the next slide. So some of the products we're going to put in have a high fixed cost and low marginal cost. And so the dollar per each doesn't really make doesn't make a lot of sense. Others are low fixed cost and high marginal cost, and the marginal cost is the slope of the curve. And so as we're building our prices, this isn't just looking something up in the RS Means book or the Sailor book or whatever book we choose to use. We're really needing to ask ourselves, what is this and how is the market going to respond, and who's going to sell this to me? And does it matter whether I buy one of these or 20 of these? This is incredibly important also when we're doing value engineering, because quite often we see there are, I don't know, 100 items, and we say, well, let's take out 5 of them because that's going to save us 5/100ths of the cost. In reality, we're only going to take out maybe 2/100ths of the cost, because the cost of getting those things in and ordered and purchased is a large fixed cost. So the next slide. And unfortunately, a lot of times these curves are not linear. So this might be something like steel, in the sense of the steel mill, a high fixed cost. So they built the factory along that first bit, and then they're starting to sell the steel. And the first bits of steel come out at a fairly linear price. Then they have to build the next factory. And so there's a big jump in cost when they bring the second factory online. And then the cost goes linear again for a period of time. And then they bring the third factory on, and it's a really efficient factory. And so the average price drops for a period of time. And this is really important as we're coming out of the COVID season, because we're starting to see these things happening. You see that the steel mills a lot of steel mills were idled in February, March, April of this year, because the demand collapsed for steel. Now that the demand is coming back, what we're seeing is they're having to restart those mills. And so you're getting this very jerky pricing. As price goes up, a mill comes online, price comes down. Price goes up, a mill comes online. So we can go to the next slide. And these are all really looking at sort of, this may sound very theoretical, very academic, but this is the sort of stuff as estimators we need to be holding in our minds. We don't have to analyze it all each time, but this is another one of those, and it's a very long word, hysteresis. You don't have to remember the word hysteresis, but it's the sense that as the demand goes up, people initially try and hold their price fairly steady, and then bump, there's a lift in price. As the demand falls, the price doesn't go back down the same curve. As the demand falls, people try and hold the price up for quite a while. They try and keep the numbers where they were, and then eventually they realize, no, I've got to take my price down, and the price goes down again. And so as part of what we need to be looking at is, which direction is our market moving? Are we seeing that, again, as I talked about, the steel prices, just headlines in the last couple of days, you're seeing initially the steel creeping up a little bit. Over the last month, the steel price has jumped very sharply. My expectation is it's going to stay fairly level for a period of time. So changes in price as the direction changes of the market is an important thing for us to understand. So the next slide. And so this is just showing what goes into the cost of a project. In a normal market, you can see there's labor and material over on the side and a normal profit. And there's a certain amount of risk profit, usually not a very big one. As the market gets busier, labor costs go up, material costs go up just a little bit. The general conditions cost goes up a little bit. The normal profit maybe stays there, but now the risk has got a little bit higher. And so the risk profit is going to increase. And then there's this excess profit, which is, not many people are bidding this year. So I think I can just tack another 5% on just because I can. And if I don't get it, there's another job down the street. So that's fine. And as other people see this excess profit being tacked on, suddenly the costs go up because people are taking extra profit because they're able to. The market will let them get away with it. And an important part is that the California Construction Cost Index, which is based on ENR, is really not measuring all of those profits. And so when they talk about what is in the index, it's just raw lumber, steel, cement powder, and a bit of labor. And so it will miss an awful lot of these shifts that are happening not just at the bidder level, but also at the supplier level. We can go to the next slide. So again, this is important as we look at markets as they saturate, because there's a fairly good chance that demand is going to pick up over the next year. And as the saturation grows, as we get closer to 100% employment, then you start seeing the excess profit rising. And you also see the risk it rising. So on difficult projects, you can see over there, low worker availability, we run out of superintendents. The risk to bidders is much higher because they're not going to have necessarily the crews they want. So again, as we look at pricing, it's not just pulling it out of a price book, it's really understanding what's going on in the market, in the micro level, what's happening in the Peralta community. So we can go to the next slide. So, okay, just so in terms of the summary here, no such thing as an objective price. A lot of things that we as estimators need to be considering. So we're going to try our next pop quiz. So let's see if this one can come up. We're going to give you a shorter time this time. You've had a bit of practice here. So let's bring the pop quiz up. So how do you make sure you're doing the right job in terms of setting your plan for the estimate? I think we're drifted off on a question here, but doing the right job in an estimate, are we just going to do what we told? Do we just email the client, or do we pick up the phone and talk to the client? So we should have some music here, shouldn't we? This should have some background.
Should have the Jeopardy theme music.
Music, okay, we need to add that in.
So we'll work on that one for the next time. So are we ready to see what the answers were? Talk to the client. Yes, good. I'm glad most of you said talk to it. Really the best way is to talk to them. Now, I think we were one quiz question off the list there. So maybe if you want to bring up the next quiz question.
Setting the course?
Yes, because we should be on the economics of pricing. So we've drifted off a little bit here. So let's skip that one. We can come back to that later if we want to there. So let's go to the economics of pricing question. Okay, so how do we determine the right price? Do we do it by looking up in a price book, just grabbing an estimate that we did last week and using that price, calling vendors and getting quotes, or considering a whole wide range of sources and factors? You may be getting a hint about some of how these questions are set up as well. So by now you should be able to see some of the ways we're doing this. So. And you notice I didn't give you an all the above question. So. Are we ready? Good. And calling vendors and getting a quote is an important answer. Again, these don't have really right answers, but I've been figuring that was under the considering a whole range of sources. So that's part of that, is calling vendors is part of this range of sources. So next slide. So the practice of pricing, we're going to move fairly quickly through this, so feel free to move the slides on. So again, this one I'm going to rest on a little bit here, is that the estimate is a judgment. There's not an absolute price. There isn't a real price. It's your professional opinion. It's your opinion is on the line. Even if we're saying, I got it out of the means book, that's because my opinion is that the number in the book is the right number. So every time I give an estimate to someone, I'm giving them my professional opinion, and my reliability is on the line. So part of that is we need to understand, how's it going to be built? How many bidders? Even if we're using lump sums or parametric models, doesn't matter. We need to understand what is it that we need to know in order to put this estimate together. So next slide. And so this is just really more of a checklist as we look through it, is we have to be asking ourselves these questions. You know, what's the direct labor? What's the non-added value labor, or non-value added, a technical term? So safety, supervision, they're not actually putting stuff in, but they're really critical to the project. And quite often, I just was working on an estimate the other night that my safety crew is costing as much as my direct value added crew, because I have to have a one safety person for every laborer because they're working 1,000 feet down a pipe. And so we have to ask those questions. You know, what's the material we're putting in? What's the temporary material, the formwork shoring? How many times do we leave out the reshoring of a concrete slab when we've taken, you know, we put the price of the slab in? Did we figure the reshoring after we take the formwork down whilst it's doing its 28-day cure? And if someone is wanting to fast track, do I need to put in more reshoring and maybe reshore 3 levels? And any waste or attic stock. Again, this project I was just doing, because it was at the end of a 1,000-foot pipeline, every time I pumped concrete in there, I was throwing away as much concrete as I was placing because I had a pumper truck full of concrete, and then equipment and stuff like that. We can go to the next slide. The general conditions or field and home office overhead. These are things we need to be considering. And then also the cost of running the risk. And sometimes we use the generic term fee. If you want to start an argument among estimators, you ask them, should it be called general conditions or general requirements, or fee or overhead? And then you can usually leave them talking, because they'll talk for several days before they realize there's no conclusion there. But we have to make sure that we've covered all of the elements. And a key part there is read the specifications. So next slide. As we're looking at labor, you know, what's the productivity, the access, the height, the congestion, inefficiencies? Have we figured out what it's going to cost to work under COVID protocols? Generally speaking, construction sites are socially distanced anyway. You very rarely get 2 construction workers very close to each other. But a lot of the COVID requirements are that the tools should be wiped down regularly. And that equipment is, you know, how you manage equipment reuse. Security or badging. If we're doing a project at the college where it's already an unoccupied building, are there protocols with respect to working around students? Are there security, background checks and things of that nature? And worker parking. So we can go to the next slide. These are ones you can look at as a separate list, but these are all things that we should be taking into consideration. And the material, again, all of these elements, you know, what's the fabrication schedule? Is it cheaper to buy in bulk or short order charges? You can see the list there and things to be considered. Tariffs is something that was a big issue in the early part of the current administration. We don't know what's going to happen with tariffs, whether they'll be lifted or whether they'll be maintained. So again, we need to be reading the news as we move forward. So next slide. So, and again, as we look at equipment, setup breakdown, does the equipment rate include fuel and supplies? And are there minimum usage periods? So next slide. And as we look at the general conditions and general and special conditions, the site management, do we have to have an on-time safety officer? Do we have to have a full-time flag person? Do we have to buy our own electricity, or is the campus going to provide electricity to us? And how much of this is being passed through to the subs? And then all the other elements about bonds and insurance and things of that nature. You can go to the next slide. And then you get to the home office overhead. What's the cost of running the business? And sometimes these questions come as if it's a smaller project, it may be being run out of the home office. And so the supervisor is charged to the home office. Sometimes on larger ones, you put a full crew out on the field. And so you can look at it as gross revenue or net service revenue. Most contractors I know will calculate their profit on 2 different levels. One is saying it's a $9 million project, I should be making somewhere around about 3-4%. Or they may be looking at saying it's a $9 million project, but I, as the prime, am only going to be actually doing $1 million worth of that work. And I really want to have 25% on my $1 million. And so those are ways they may calculate it. Again, we need to be looking at it in both ways. And again, just understanding how we think the bidders are going to be putting their estimate together. So we can go to the next slide. And so then we come to the last bit of the price buildup is the profit. And so again, this is their price for their taking their risk and the return on equity capital. It all is based on how much risk there is and what the market will bear in terms of profit. We can go to the next slide. So other things we need to consider, overtime, phasing, any special handling, workforce housing, unlikely to be an issue here, but if we were doing a remote project, we might have workforce housing. Next slide. Fees, gross receipts tax, permits, any operational maintenance information. We're increasingly seeing that contracts are requiring the installers to provide operational training. So it's no longer a question of, okay, here's the manual for operating this air handler. But quite often now we see a requirement in the specifications that they have to provide video training and a minimum of so many hours of training on the operation so that the operation staff can continue the work. And so is that included in our price? Next slide. And then just a few other considerations. Do we have prevailing wages? Do we have to maintain existing operations? Are there limitations on operations? Do we have to do any cleaning or sterilization? All of these other elements you can see on the screen here. So we go to the next slide. So summary. I ran through this very, very quickly. The expectation is that I'm understanding you have this available to you to look through. This isn't a point at which I'm going to tell you exactly how you analyze all of these things. It's just more giving you a list of the things. We build our prices up. We need to be considering this every time. We don't always do it from the bottom up. I can tell you, we don't have the time in our estimates to say every single price I will go through and say, what's my productivity? What am I going to be able to do? But we need to be able to understand those questions, even if we pull it out of the pricing book or look at our old estimate or we call a supplier, we have to apply that level of thought. And one of the really critical things is talk about it in the office, have a peer conversation. It is always the case that together we're smarter than we are on our own. And so I'm sure everyone on this call is the smartest person on the call. And everyone here is a really well-skilled estimator and very good at putting prices together. But we will always benefit from saying, hey, how do you think they're going to build this thing? And then the last bit about it is making sure that we document it for the record and the QA process. So we can go to our next pop quiz. Let's see how this one works. So this should be practice of pricing. 2 questions, and these are really honesty questions. How often do you really, tell the truth now, how often do you read all the way through the specifications when you're doing an estimate? Do you always do it usually, or is the answer really, what are specifications? And then in the absence of specifications, how often, this is not how should you, but how often do you really discuss the key requirements with the design team? 2 tough questions, but they're really just, should be easy to answer, quick to answer. So let's see how we do with those.
And we also have another question in the Q&A.
Yes, I'm just looking at that. Can an estimate be weighted to prioritize an element to meet the client's goals? I'm going to answer the question a little bit with a question in terms of what we mean by weighted, but we certainly should be paying attention to the client's goals. And so if someone is saying, I would like a building with a fabulous exterior, as we're building budgets, we should be making sure that's adequately funded. I wouldn't necessarily just double the price of a particular item in an estimate. So I apologize, I'm not entirely getting the question correct as to what you're looking for there. But yes, we need to be prioritizing the client's goals. So if I have failed, as I suspect I have done, if I have failed to answer your question properly, please supplement it. but if I have answered it, I'll count myself lucky there. So, so we have 53% of people who claim they always read all the way through the specifications, and the same 53%, I suspect it's the same people who will always ask the questions. That's really good. I appreciate those of you who are honest and saying, yeah, I occasionally look through it. I'm not saying that those who say always is not honest, but it is an important thing for us to be able to make sure that we really do look through the schedules, the specifications. So next slide. And everyone doing okay? We're getting well through this thing. So managing the estimate uncertainty. So now we're moving into areas where we could be looked at as being a little embarrassing. We're meant to be estimated. We shouldn't have uncertainty in our estimates. But we really do. There's always uncertainty. Any estimate of the future, which is what an estimate, a construction cost estimate is we're really trying to say, what do we think other people think? And so there's always uncertainty in that. So the 4 key steps to it: to identify, to evaluate, to plan, and to do something about it. So what is the uncertainty? How big or how bad is it? How scary is it? And what are we going to do about it? And then let's do it. So let's go to the next one. So for estimating purposes, the identification of the risk is what could change the outcome. And partly this is just sitting down and having a chat session among people, is how wrong could I be? You know, what is it I'm missing? What might happen? You know, we could have a pandemic. Now that'll never happen. Okay, now we've learned it can happen. There could be, and usually someone will come up and say, well, there could be an asteroid strike. But really what we're looking at is what are the things that are reasonably likely to happen that could really distort the outcome? And then the evaluation is how much could it do, what direction, and how skewed. I'm going to come to skewed in a moment, but how big can this be? And oftentimes you'll sit around in the room and people will start bringing up all the risks, and they sound big and scary. And oftentimes people use that as a way of avoiding doing something. And so all these things are thrown out. It'll never work. It can't be done. The evaluation is how we encapsulate and bound the risk, put boundaries around it, put fences around it. So we can go to the next, you can do the next click. So typically when we're doing an estimate, we're looking at the 50th percentile value. What's the most likely value we're doing? And then we start asking the questions, and you're seeing these P numbers. Those are probability numbers. Oh, sorry, you want to go back to that one there? That's good. Sorry. we didn't necessarily say where the clicks end there, so I appreciate this. And so you see the first one that came up was it was evenly distributed. It could go either way and fairly narrowly bounded. So the P10, the 10th percent probability, and the 90th percentile probability, fairly close to the midpoint value. So we're saying we think there's 1,000 cubic yards in those foundations, might be as low as 850, 950, might be as high as 1,050, but we're fairly confident in those numbers. In estimating, we usually use something like the 10th percentile and 90th percentile, because I don't want to try and figure out what's the 100th percentile, what's the worst this could ever possibly be. So we're looking at what's the reasonable range of possibilities. The second one that came up, again, evenly distributed, but fairly broadly spread this time. So we're saying there's a lot of uncertainty here. We need to deal with this. And then this last one, which is the skewed, which is, you know, and this is what most prices are. I think that's $100. It might come in at 90, but it could also come in at 150. And so really understanding how the spread of those probabilities is working. Typically within an estimate, we're not going to take it to the step of a calculated Monte Carlo analytical, but even if we can just get to this sense of how wrong might I be, and which side of wrong am I? So we can click on the next slide. And then we plan it. And so what do we think we can reduce by management and mitigation? You know, this could come in at $150. Is there anything I can do to make sure it comes in at not all that high number? well, maybe we tighten up the specifications. Maybe we go out and buy it early, or a range of opportunities. Maybe we make sure that there are enough bidders to cover it. And only after we've done that mitigation and management do we then say, okay, how much do we still have to have a contingency in for? And usually the contingency is there to take you from the 50th percentile, probably, you know, we're saying, I think this should bid for $100. It could bid as high as 120. So I'm going to have a contingency in my back pocket to manage the chance that it might come in at 120. And then the implementation and monitor, is there a way we're making sure we're staying on track? So next slide. So for estimate, oh, we've jumped one there, sorry. The next slide, for estimating purposes, sorry, one back from that. Let us stay there. We use three things in our estimates for managing uncertainty. We use an allowance when it's a known scope, but it's just not identified. So we might say we've got an allowance in for miscellaneous carpentry. We know we haven't quite figured out where all the bits of wood are going to go, and the blocking and the backing and all of that sort of stuff. But it's a bounded thing. We know it's going to be in there. Or we might have an allowance for the painting of piping. We haven't measured it all, but we know it's going to be in there. The contingency really is for an unknown scope or an unknown conditions. It's just not on the drawings yet, and we just don't know how the design is going to develop. And so we have a contingency to cover the development of the design. And then at a certain point, we might just have to say, we're just going to give you a range. It could come in somewhere between 100 and 120. And I don't want to pad the estimate to put it in at 120 now and be surprised later. So we're just going to tell you the range of probability is that it's between 100 and 120. So we can go to the next slide. So generally speaking, as I say, the base estimate takes us to the P50, the 50th, the most likely outcome. The contingency, you noticed we've dropped it now to the 80th percentile. Generally, we don't cushion all the way to the 90th percentile. We put a contingency in to say, this is how much you may want to have in your back pocket to cover reasonably foreseeable things that could happen to us. The reasonable range is usually in the 10 to 90% range. And then the worst case is that 100th percentile. Very rarely do we really care about the worst case. But if it is one where we can't withstand the worst case, then we have to know what it is and be ready for it. So next slide. So again, the contingencies, we might have design contingencies. It usually disappears by the time we get to the end of design. The bid contingency, the markets are uncertain, so we don't know how the bids are going to come in a year from now. Construction contingency to cover change orders and adjustments. And then lastly, an owner contingency to cover owner-driven changes. And in the early stages, we should have all of those four contingencies at least explicit, even if they're an explicit zero. So we can go to the next slide. And this is just recognizing that early stages scope uncertainty is fairly high. That should diminish as we get to the bid. Market uncertainty is going to stay there. We're really never very confident on where the market is going to be on any given day. So next slide. Summary here, we have to recognize and address uncertainty, make sure that we characterize it, and it's up to the client to define the acceptable risk level. I see so many times when people just say, oh, well, I'm being conservative in my numbers. By what right are we being conservative? The client may want to be more aggressive in their pricing. And so we need to get from the client, you know, do you want to have a number that's the 80th percentile? Do you want to have a number at the 50th percentile? Do you even want to have a number at the 10th percentile? You feel lucky today. So we're going to skip this next pop quiz. We'll go on to the next slide here. So closely related to risk is managing escalation. So we can go to the next slide. We've touched on a lot of this material in terms of the market is really, prices are dependent on the market. And most of us get hooked on this cost push escalation. Prices have gone up, so it's pushing my price up. Whereas really the biggest driver of construction escalation, particularly in the current markets in California, is demand pull. Increases or decreases in demand allow for non-competitive pricing. So we really always have to understand where the market is going and understanding how hungry people are in terms of their bidding. And the key thing again here is almost all escalation is demand pull. Oil didn't go negative just because suddenly it was leaping out of the ground for free. It was because nobody wanted oil. Steel prices haven't gone up in the last month because steel has suddenly become more difficult to make. It's because of demand pulling it. So we can go to the next slide. So just cost push escalation is all the input costs, your direct labor, your materials. An important part of cost push, though, is remembering there's change in code and change in practice. We're going to have a new code cycle come out. It will almost certainly increase the cost for construction in California. We're going to see how to manage urban wildlife fire interface. Not as big a deal in the Peralta community, but it is going to be a factor. We're seeing increasing energy code requirements. And so we need to be following the code cycle, because if we're looking at projects that are more than 4 years out, we're actually into 2 cycles of code. So are we including an allowance in for code and practice? So we can go to the next slide. And so generally cost push is 2 to 3%, 2 to 4% per annum. And what our experience is that code and practice is usually clicks out about 1% per annum. And it's usually easy to measure, which is why you see a lot of indexes, ENR, means, Marshall and Swift. They're all input price indexes, which means they're all following what's happening to input prices, which means they're all largely missing the reality of escalation. And you'll see lots and lots of charts that show this is the trend on the price of oil. This is the trend on the price of steel. So take them all with a pinch of salt. Next slide. So cost pull, demand pull is total demand, the size of the market. It might be a fairly large market in Northern California, but we might find that there's an awful lot of construction going on elsewhere. And how attractive is your project set against all the other projects? So what's the ease of doing business and the payment record? Do they want to work on your project? So we can go to the next slide. And so again, this can run well over 10% per annum. We've seen that in the Bay Area over the last 10 years. It can also go down at over 10% per annum. It's incredibly hard to measure. It's very unpredictable. We will often use employment activity as a useful proxy for that. So look at how busy the market is, and that'll give you a sense of it. So we go to the next slide. So again, this is the one we showed earlier. It's the same thing. It's just reminding us that those ENR indexes, the CCCI, which is built on ENR, just doesn't match the demand pull. The next slide. So actually I missed a slide there, but we can go to a pop quiz, the escalation pop quiz. You're bringing up the pop quiz there.
Just a moment.
Yep, no, I'm just checking. I was wanting to make sure I hadn't frozen there. The great joys of Zoom. If it's not.
Speaking of the joys of Zoom, polls have disappeared. Just
okay, well, we'll skip that. We'll come back to that one later. We've had enough of polls anyway. So the last bit about it is how we present the estimate. So next slide. So when we present the estimate, these are some of the key things that we need to make sure we're dealing with. And one of the really big ones is this. This comes from the Navy protocols, bottom line up front. We really need to make sure that we're communicating the key findings as quickly as we can. The number of times I wade through an estimate and it's on the 10th or 11th page before I find, what are you telling me? They've told me all the stuff they've excluded. They've told me all the stuff that they've included. They've told me that if I get 5 or more bids, I'm going to get 20% off the job. They've told me all of these things, and I'm waiting, you know, okay, so yeah, tell me what is the estimate? So let's get the bottom line up front. We need to show a clarity of thought. Typically, if I'm wading through 10 pages of estimate before, or 10 pages of text before I find the estimate, I'm getting bored and I'm starting not to trust the estimator. Consistency of finding, let's make sure we're laying out key findings. Let's put a description in so that the client say, oh yeah, you estimated the project I asked you to. Sorry, go back one. Are we able to go back a slide there? Oh, good. Lay out the basis, lay out the risk, lay out schedule, and make sure we're doing appropriate rounding. Then you can put all the fluff, all the backup, and all the detail. Next slide. And then we have to make sure we're doing quality checks. In the same way as on construction, we have quality management. For some reason on our estimating, we get away with spell check, missing, or grammar check. A sanity check, that bit where we say, yeah, I know that's what the number is telling me, but does it make sense to me? Visual check is exactly what it means, is that prop this thing up on the wall and look at it and say, does it look pretty? Does it look cluttered? Are we using a font that is difficult to read? And again, you might say, well, that doesn't really matter because of the number is the number. And that's true, ultimately, as the number is what's important. But if we're trying to help a client feel comfortable and confident in what we're doing, it should look clean and tidy. And then the cleanliness of graphics, to me, neatness of product reflects clarity of thought. If I see a cluttered estimate, I'm starting to think, does this person really have a way of thinking logically? And it also shows care and attention. It shows that they care enough about me to have taken the time to make it look good. And then the last bit about it is following up, make sure it's been received and understood. So call the client. Did you get it? Yes. I mean, just because I sent it doesn't mean it got there. And so I should call them. I know we're all guilty of what because as you was mentioned at the start, I've got a few years of practice. What we used to talk about in estimating is fax and run. So it comes to 5 o'clock in the evening, the estimate is due, slap it on the fax machine, and by the time it's finished whirring through the machine, I'm out of the door. No, we can't do that. We have to call them. Did you get it? Does it make sense? Do you have any questions? Are you comfortable? Anything else I need to do? So next slide. So just a review now to sort of wrap up, and we can move into question and answer period. And this has been a romp through. The one part in the earlier question is, I'm going to show you how to read blueprints. I haven't yet figured out how to tell people how to read blueprints when I'm working on a Zoom presentation, but I'm hoping we've covered all the other parts of it. So let's go to the next slide. So coming back to this summary, the 12 points from the Government Accountability Office, or General Accountability Office, 12 steps being, start one, define the purpose. We've talked about that. Develop your plan. Then make sure we're doing the program, the estimating structure, identify the ground rules, obtain the data, develop the point estimate, so that you're into number 6 before you're actually really doing the estimate. Then sensitivity analysis. I haven't talked about that. But that's related to the risk. How wrong could I be? And how much does this vary if I change some of my input parameters? And then conducting your risk and uncertainty analysis. And you can see a feedback loop that might just say, hey, I've done my testing and I need to go back and change some things in the estimate. And then the last 3 steps, documenting the estimate, presenting it to management for approval, and then updating it if it needs to change. So next slide. And that's landing us back on the goals, which is, we can push one more click there and it should have what the goals are: defining the estimate, how we develop pricing data. And so now it's open to questions and answers. Well, questions at least. We'll see if we'll get good answers from me. So let's move on. And you should have seen all the bits on the cutting room floor.
That was good timing too. Yeah, that was great. We're getting a lot of feedback about the presentation. So you have kept up the bar for the Build Peralta Academy subject matter expert instructor. Did you have a question for the class? Because you had some other questions.
Actually, I was thinking of that in it. I was trying to frame it in that I'm interested to know how many of the group are practicing in estimating specifically. I should maybe have asked that at the start, so that because I might have been talking to people who really knew what they were doing and knew better than me. But
so you wanted to know how many are actually estimators in the class that actually do it for a living? Is that what you're asking the class?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and you put in the chat box. I know we have a design engineer that's on.
Yes.
Because they put anybody that is an estimator in the class.
Anybody who wants to disagree with anything I said, challenge any of my statements?
No one dares.
I was thinking the same thing, Keith. Okay. I don't see any chat. So it looks like we don't have any estimators in the class. Oh, yep. And someone else said they wouldn't dare challenge you. So that answers that question.
Well, and I would challenge that never daring to challenge, because we are always we're always smarter by challenging.
Okay, someone says I estimate cost of security for construction sites.
Okay, great.
Okay, that's good. Time to type, huh?
Thinking of the idea of challenging is, I enjoy understanding words, and the word argument is a word we often turn down, but it's actually related to the word argent, shiny. And so an argument is that which makes something shiny. It polishes. So we want to be polished. We want to have good, robust conversation, because that's how we learn more about our product.
That's a great way to look at it. That's a good way to look at that. So now the opinions are coming in. You just gave everybody. This person says, I do not have to estimate my own cost for what I do, but it's minimum in comparison to design build companies.
Yes, it's the same principles, but I'm seeing also a question, hey, do I have a practice of using percentage loading using uniformat process to allow for more accurate estimate, having them using the master format? Is the question there converting from uniformat into master format? Because or saying that when I'm starting in the very earliest stages, that I think 20% of the cost is in foundations and 30% is in cladding. A lot of times with uniformat, my goal is to start off by looking at function, because function drives quantity. So I might say, yes, I use the uniformat initially. So looking at the uniformat, I would say, if I'm wanting to build a classroom building with classrooms that are going to be typically, I would say, 30 feet deep and a corridor and then another 30 foot on the other side, based on the function of that space, I can then do a very quick assessment of how much, what shape the building is going to be. So the geometry follows the function. So I can then build up conceptual quantities, parametric quantities based on the program, and then apply qualitative prices. So I can say, okay, because it's a classroom building, it's going to have roughly 40% of exterior skin compared to the floor area. I think we want to buy a $90 skin because that's in the catalog. That's sort of the range of products we want to have in the skin. So $90 on the skin times 40% on the floor is 9 times 4 is 36. So $36 a square foot goes into my exterior cladding category. When it comes sorry, excuse me, when it comes time to convert that into master format, getting towards the bidding time, then the only way I know how to do that is really I have to know what the material is. I know that skin now is a mixture of precast, cast, and curtain wall. So it's going to be allocated to CSI Division 8 and Division 3. And so I can then do that by a percentage allocation, usually at the point at which I'm transferring from uniformat into master format. I have enough details. So typically what I do is I just run through the estimate and say, this line item belongs to uniformat, to master format line item, whatever. So it can be done by a percentage basis. It's more accurately done by actually reading the document and saying, you know, in uniformat, I've got $60 for electrical systems, but that's broken into electrical and communications and things like that for the CSI. So I don't know if that answered the question. I see another one in the chat. How much has the demand for construction resources resulting from California fires impacted Oakland construction labor material costs? What suggestions do you have for managing cost escalation next and subsequent years? Oh, you have to pay for that. No. The California fires have done two things. One of them is primarily that it's impacting residential level construction. And so most of the Peralta work is not the same as the residential level construction. Also, it's typically in the more rural areas where the labor rate is cheaper. And so it's not going to pull laborers from Oakland because they're not going to leave work in Oakland to go work out in the rural areas for less money. And so there's a certain point at which the fires are actually not impacting the Peralta level of construction. But generally speaking, they are having an impact on, they're having some impact because there's a little bit of draw of work and it is pushing up material prices a certain amount. I would say the other area where it's having an impact is it's changing the codes. Codes usually follow a disaster. And so we're going to see much more stringent fire management. You know, they're going to be looking at that and looking a little bit at some of the fires that have happened to the high-rise buildings in Britain, the big cladding fire. And so we're going to see changes occurring there. I would say more relevant is what's happening with, you know, what's going to be the case as we exit the COVID period. We've had a massive crushing of demand through COVID. And so as we move into the new year, we're going to see several demand pick up. People suddenly say, well, I didn't get my building built last year, let's build it now. And so there's going to be sort of quite a lot of jerkiness in that things are going to not move and then something's going to move suddenly. Steel prices, as I say, is an example that the steel price, the raw mill steel price this time last year was about $650 a ton. It dropped to around $400 a ton in July of this year. It's now just shot up to about $850 a ton because demand is outstripping the ability to bring on the supply. As mills come back online, we're going to see the price most likely dip down again, maybe down to about 600, and then demand might push it back down to 400, depending on how quickly things pick up. We're also then going to see things. So what you're going to see is an awful lot of price jumping around as people try and pick where they think the market is going to be. And for bidders, that's going to be really tough because, again, construction bidders are really bidding on what they think everybody else is going to bid on. There's the old joke about, you know, if you're in the woods being chased by a bear with your friend, you don't have to run faster than the bear, you just have to run faster than your friend. And so that's the one where I'm not bidding on what I think it's going to cost, I'm going to bid because I'm thinking, so-and-so is going to be here. I just want to be a few dollars cheaper. I just have to be $1 cheaper than the next person. When the market is uncertain, I don't know what the other people are going to bid. I mean, and none of this is illegal bid rigging. I'm just trying to guess what other people are bidding. But I'm going to be trying to figure out, do I think that, I'm seeing on the screen Keith here, pick you out because you're with me in AECOM, you know, I think Keith has got a lot of work coming up, so he's maybe not going to be very hungry. So I don't have to be really low on his number, but you know, Shonda's really looking for work, so she's most likely going to beat me on this price. So if I want to beat Shonda, I'm going to have to try and get in under her. And I might find that I misjudged it and I was way lower than anyone else. So I'm gonna, my next bid, I'm going to be a lot higher because I'm trying to recapture some of that money. And so the bids move very erratically in these transitional times. So my recommendation really is, how do you manage cost escalation? And the big issue really is, how do you manage uncertainty? Because cost escalation is, for the next 6 months, I'm going to say, is going to be fairly unpredictable. So it goes back to the risk management process. How safe do I want to be? Maybe I'll say, I think escalation is going to be pretty steep next year, so I'm going to put an extra contingency in. And if it isn't as steep as I think it's going to be, I'm going to have some money to play with a little bit later. I've got something I can do something else on another project. Or I might have alternates to soak up some of the gravy if there is some. So I've got covered and I'm safe. We're going to have to watch markets very, very closely. We're going to have to watch an awful lot of stuff very closely. But the management at this point, I would say, is management of uncertainty and not relying on what people are telling you. Because there will, you know, you can open up 5 economists' opinions and you'll end up with 10 answers. My bet is that in practice, we're not going to see a lot of escalation over the next 12 months. We're going to see patches of escalation, but for the large part, I don't think the spot price of steel is going to stay up at 800. I think it's going to go back down to sort of 600. And it's going to be a relatively smooth set of number, or relatively low escalation, provided we can pitch the markets properly. So a very long rambling answer to a very challenging question about escalation.
Great. I think that was our last question.